Okay, so I'm really happy to be able to present to that seminar actually, because this is a paper that mixes a bit of the migration literature with the trade literature. And usually the kind of audience to which we are presenting that paper is more focused on the trade part. And so I expect to have many interesting comments on the larger issue on the migration part in particular. So this is a joint work with Angie Tressa, which is a PhD student at the TEMA in Cergy-Pontoise. What we are trying to do is basically to look at all European integration, in particular the enlargement of the EU in 2004 to a certain number of Central and Eastern European countries affected, led to a substitution between offshoring and immigration, meaning that following the enlargement, there was a large migration wave of Eastern European migrants to Western Europe, and we think that we can provide some evidence that this wave actually led to a reduction in the intensity of offshoring. So this EU enlargement of 2004 is quite an interesting shock because it's actually a double shock for Europe. On one hand, you have a trade shock because at the enlargement, all tariffs were abandoned between Eastern and Western Europe, and also Eastern Europe entered the common market. So there was a real trade shock, a unification of rules for trading goods and also services. On the other hand, there was also a labor mobility shock because as Central and Eastern European countries entered the EU, the citizens were suddenly able to travel throughout the entire Europe. But actually, if you think about it, there's a gap between these two shocks. So trade, it was fully liberalized in 2004, and even before to a large extent because the EU already had a large number of agreements with the new entrants. But regarding the labor mobility aspect, things took a bit more time. So at the date of the enlargement in 2004, only the UK, Ireland, and Sweden really opened the labor market, meaning that Eastern European migrants, Eastern European citizens could move to UK, Ireland, and Sweden fully from 2004, but not to other Western European countries. Other European countries, they decided to implement temporary restrictions on the entrance of Eastern European workers. And these restrictions were not put an end at the same date for each country, meaning that we have a migration shock, which was staggered across country, and we want to use this gap in Western Europe labor markets opening to these workers from Central and Eastern Europe to see how the surge in the presence of migrant workers affected offshoring from non-member states at the sectoral level. So we are going to use a measure of offshoring, which is a value-added imports in intermediate good, which we think is is relatively new measure in that literature, and is quite interesting as it really describes what we are interested. So let me give you a bit more detail on the idea. So you know that EU integration, it implies freedom of movement of workers, but actually you had some temporary restrictions which were allowed. The maximum period was 7 years after 2004. What is important here is to be reminded that it was a political decision. It was political because each individual Western European countries decided or not to implement this restriction, and they were not forced to do it except through domestic pressure. Usually these restrictions were decided quite late, so it means that France did not announce, let's say 4 years before the integration, that they were going to implement some restriction, but only a few months before or 1 year before the actual enlargement. And as such, they could hardly be anticipated because there was a lot of group dynamics. So for instance, the UK and Ireland did not introduce restriction, mostly because they didn't think that other countries would introduce restriction for a long time. But once a few countries in Western Europe decided to implement those, a lot of other Western European countries followed suit. Another important thing with this restriction is that they could be removed and then reintroduced. So it's actually what happened with Spain in 2011 when they decided to reintroduce restriction on Romanian citizens after removing them. So it was really political. So here you have a small schedule of the liberalization for various countries. So as I said, in 2004, at the date of the enlargement, only 3 countries totally open, and then all the other Western European countries, all the other old EU countries followed in the following years until 2011 for the enlargement of 2004. Regarding the enlargement of 2007, it took even a bit more time. It went until 2014. On the other hand, trade was liberalized at once. And also, before 2004, there was already a large number of trade agreements. And they were limited, but they were also asymmetric, meaning that Western Europe actually liberalized its market much more to Eastern Europe than the opposite. This was largely anticipated. And actually, the average tariff applied even at the time of even before the integration was not that high. So I'm insisting on that aspect because I want to convince you that actually we can look at the effect of this labor market liberalization shock independently from the trade aspect of the question. So what are the main results? So we are going to show that a new member state, so Eastern European immigrants working in manual occupation and offshoring from Western Europe to Eastern Europe are substitutes, meaning that in the post-liberalization period, there was a substitution between employing immigrants in Western Europe and offshoring to Eastern Europe. We also show that there doesn't seem to be a strong adverse effect on native workers of Western European countries, and that these inflows of Eastern European workers will also seem to replace other immigrants in Western Europe, and they reduce offshoring to not only to Eastern Europe, but also to the rest of the world. The mechanism that we have in mind is that even before the enlargement, a lot of sectors of Western European sectors already offshored a number of low-skilled tasks to Eastern Europe, either because they had unfilled worker needs, they couldn't hire the relevant type of workers, or these workers were too expensive in Western Europe, so it was less expensive to actually produce the goods in Eastern Europe. But when the labor market opened to Eastern European workers, there was an inflow of those workers in Western Europe, which increased the availability of immigrant work and decreases the cost of employing immigrants. So everything else equal, sectors are going to reduce offshoring and instead hire immigrants. So the way this is linked to the rest of the literature is that broadly, this paper is linked with 3 branches of the literature. The first one is the network effect one. Basically, there's a large literature looking at the migration trade nexus. A lot of these papers, they show that there's a pro-trade effect of immigration because the arrival of foreign citizens is going to reduce asymmetry of information and is going to foster trade between the different countries. Usually these papers, they focus on exports, meaning that the idea would be that if you have Polish workers arriving in France, France would export more to Poland. You have a few papers who are really looking at the effect on imports, and in particular, looking at trade in intermediates, which is what we're going to do. We're looking at trade in intermediate because trade in intermediate is really something that is closer to offshoring, as you're going to consider only the intermediate part of the goods which are going to be consumed later. So I can cite Eger and Erhardt or RU 2019. but one of the things that they do not do as, but the setup is quite different from ours. And in particular, they are not really focused on the effect of European integration. They are focused on a really micro level data. But what they do is that they, to some extent, they look at a substitution between migration and offshoring. This is the second branch of the literature to which we're really close. So you had a first paper, a seminal paper by Ramaswamy in 1968 that looked at this substitution or this complementarity between foreign workers and offshoring. And then you have a lot of more modern papers, empirical papers, looking at this substitutability, complementarity effect. One of the interesting things is that in that literature, usually the focus is either at the country level, meaning if you have more immigrant worker in the country, that country on aggregated is going to import more or less intermediate good, or at the very firm level, so at a really micro level. What we do here is we innovate compared to that literature because we look at the sectoral level, which is something which is quite interesting actually, because you might think that the firm, the company that is hiring immigrants and the company that is offshoring is not necessarily the same. So you can have an ecosystem of firms which are related to each other's, but the one with a various relationship between them, but the one who is hiring immigrant is not necessarily the one that would be offshoring in the first place. Looking at the sectoral level in that sense, it helps to really have all the effect, all the possible substitution between migration and offshoring. One of the other innovations that we do compared to that literature is a measure of offshoring. The measure of offshoring that we're going to use is the domestic value added in intermediate goods created in the country of origin. So we are going to be able to isolate the part of imports of intermediate goods that is actually produced in the origin country of workers. The last literature which is related to what we do is the literature on labor mobility in EU context, and in particular, I want to cite Caliendo and others 2018 papers, which look also at the effect of this labor market liberalization in Europe, but they do something quite different from what we do because we're actually looking at the welfare effect, whereas we are more focused on the trade effect of labor market liberalization. So we use two main sources of data. The first one is the labor force survey database. And this LFS database allows us to construct the migration part of our data. So this database is very well known, very well widely exploited. It's an individual level data, and we're going from 2004 to 2013, simply because before this period, we do not have any information on the origin of workers, so we cannot distinguish immigrants from natives. And using this data, we create the share of workers in a sector S of a country J on year T that are born in origin I. So this is going to be the share of immigrants that we're going to use to construct our migration shock. We have 11 destination countries, which is basically all of the old EU countries minus Germany, Finland, Sweden, and Italy, simply because for those countries, we do not have the data which is necessary in the LFS to construct this share of workers which are immigrants. So for instance, in Germany, we do not have any information regarding the country of birth of the worker. So we cannot construct this share using that data. Then we have 9 origin countries. Actually, those are origin blocks. So in the LFS, we do not have any information on the actual country of birth, but on a group of country of birth. So we know if a worker, for instance, is born in NMS10, which are the 10 countries that entered the EU in 2004, or if they are born in NMS3, which are Romania, Bulgaria, and Croatia, or in Latin America, etc. Then we have 13 sectors, and we are able to also to disaggregate the share of foreign-born workers in 3 occupation groups. So high, which is basically managers and professional, medium, which are associate professional and clerks, and low skill workers, which are all the other workers. Then we merge that migration data, let's say, to our trade data. For the trade aspect, we use WIOD, so the World Input Output Database, which gives an input output, which gives all input output entries for 42 economies in the world, and also an aggregation for the rest of the world in 56 sectors. So it's not all the country of the world, but it represents 80% of world trade. So this is quite very substantial, actually. Then we use the Wang and others 2010 decomposition to divide exports of origin countries in 4 groups that you can see here. And the one that we're going to be focusing on is the domestic value added absorbed abroad. So with that measure, we can say how much of the value of intermediated goods exported by Eastern Europe to Western Europe that was actually added in Eastern Europe instead of simply re-exported. So it's what we are going to consider as our measure of offshoring, because it's actually the value which was added in the exported country. One of the nice thing with that variable is also that it's quite uncorrelated with the presence of immigrant communities, meaning that we are not going to have, we exclude to a large extent the network effect that would lead immigrant communities to bring some information on the country of origin that would facilitate imports or export of final goods. So the final data set that we use goes from 2004 to 2013, so only the post-enlargement period, and that's why this difference in the timing of the liberalization of the labor market is going to be important in our strategy. We have 13 sectors, 11 new countries, and a certain number of origin countries. I'm going to go quickly with a few stylus facts. So the first thing that I want to show you is the way exports and imports of value-added trade in intermediate goods change over before and after the integration. So what this graph shows is whether or not imports and export of Western European countries increase faster after the integration or before. More or less what we can see is that for export, you can see that pretty much all sectors, the imports of all sectors, the export of all sectors increase faster after enlargement. Whereas for imports, it's much more mixed. And for a large number of sectors, the imports did not really change after the integration. The reason I'm showing you that is simply because I want to emphasize the fact that a large part of the trade was already liberalized in 2004 because of the various trade agreements and because the enlargement was anticipated. And so there's not such a strong effect for many sectors on the import side compared to the export side. Then in that graph, you have three elements. So on the left-hand side, you have I'm going to skip the left-hand side actually to go faster. In the middle graph, what you have is the share of imports of domestic value added of Western European countries that comes from Eastern European countries. And we split the all the countries and sectors in various percentile. So it means that the orange line, for instance, gives you the evolution of that share of imports of Western European countries coming from Eastern Europe only for the top 10% of country sector pairs. The main thing that I want to show you here is that actually the evolution of trade between Eastern and Western Europe was really concentrated in a few country and sector pairs. So obviously, if you look at the entire sample, the blue line here, you can see that there is a progressive increase, but there's a large variation for a minority of sectors. And this is something that we also find for the migration side. So on the right-hand side panel, you have the share of workers born in Eastern Europe in Western European countries. And in the same way, it's divided in various percentile, and you can see that actually the evolution is positive, mostly for the top 25% of country sector pairs, meaning that Eastern European immigrants did not went to all sectors in Western Europe, in Western Europe in the same way, but they mostly concentrated in a few sectors, which we think are sectors that actually had some needs that were a bit more strong. And the last thing that I want to show you before presenting to you the empirical strategy is justify a bit more the idea of using the gap in the labor market liberalization for investigation. So what we are doing is we are trying to look at the evolution of the share of Eastern European immigrants working in Western European countries with the time, but we're removing all country and sector specificities using some country sector fixed effect. This allows us to basically trace the evolution of the share of Eastern European migrants in Western Europe across years, and then we can divide in the various samples. So if you look at that graph here, you can see in the top panel the progressive increase in the share of NMS10 workers in all Western European countries. So clearly in 2005, the increase is not so significant yet, but in 2006 and in the following years, there is a strong and progressive increase in the share of Eastern European workers. Then if we remove the two countries that we have in our sample that already opened the labor market in 2004, so the United Kingdom and Ireland, you can see in the lower panel, in the down panel, that actually the increase took a bit more time to become really significant. So if we only keep the countries that did not open the labor market in 2004, you can see that in 2004, 5 and 6 and 7, actually, there is no such large increase in the share of immigrants, but that it comes progressively. And the reason why it comes progressively and it starts in 2007 and 2008 is simply because those countries did not open the labor market to Eastern European immigrants before. So the empirical strategy really relies on this idea that the goods market was liberalized, but not in 2004, but not the labor markets. So most countries, they chose to wait 1 or several years. And what we're going to do is we're going to focus so we were going to focus on the 2 country blocks of origin for which we can actually look at this labor market opening. So we're going to call them NMS 10. So these are the 10 countries that entered in 2004. So from Estonia to Malta. And NMS 3, which are the 3 countries that enter later in 2007 and for Croatia in 2013. So for these 2 block of countries, we can build a variable which we are going to call lib_IGT, which is a dummy equal to 1, starting at the year where the Western European country J liberalized its labor market to the citizens of this eastern country. And then we're going to look to estimate the value of the domestic value-added intermediate goods originating from block I, so from Eastern Europe, and used in Western Europe country J, in the sector S in year T, on the share of migrants in the same sector and the share of migrants coming from the same block of origin. Then we're going to add this liberalization dummy, and we're going to interact the liberalization dummy with the migrant share. So the interaction between the liberalization dummy and the migration is in the migrant share is actually a post-liberalization migration shocks. It tells us the effect, is going to give us the effect of the presence of Eastern European immigrants in Western Europe in the post-liberalization period, where at the time when we see a surge in immigration. So this specification, to sum up, it matches the use of migrant workers in a country J to work in sector S with the imports of value added produced by sector S in origin country I. So really comparing for a given sector whether it's going to use immigrant workers or if it's going to import goods produced by the same sector in the origin country of that workers. So we're testing the substitution between importing the goods or using immigrant workers. Obviously, there are some endogeneity issue, so there could be some omitted variable bias in order to control for this kind of issue. We use a combined fixed effect structure, but there could also be some reverse causality. So it could be that actually firms that are integrating into European value chains, so firms that want to export their intermediate goods to Western Europe, are going to firms that want to offshore to Eastern Europe. I say it again because I lost myself. So firms are going to integrate into European value chains. They might decide to actually recruit Eastern European workers to facilitate this integration. So in that case, we would have both import of intermediate goods and immigration to support it. So what we do in order to avoid that possibility is first, we focus on the share of migrant post-labor market opening. So we use this migration shock. We use that gap in the trade liberalization and the labor market liberalization that facilitated migration. And we also use an instrumental variable. So the instrumental variable is quite standard. It's a shift share a la carte, which is based on lag geographic distribution. So we compute, in the first step, we compute the number, we compute an expected number of migrants from country J, from country I, in country J in sector S and year T, using the total number of migrants from a given origin, going to a given destination, and then using the distribution of those migrants a few years before in 2000 between the different origin country and within each country between the different sectors. Then using this expected number of migrants, we construct a migrant share that is going to be our instrument. So afterwards, one of the weakness of the shift share as we constructed it is clearly the fact that the date that we use for the distribution of migrants between the different countries and the different sectors is not so far removed from the date of the enlargement and the date of a sample, basically. So in a robustness check, we also use different dates, more removed dates, to ensure that the instrument still holds. So these tables present our baseline results. So in the first three columns, in the first two columns, sorry, you have the result in estimated with an OLS. The coefficient of our interest here is one of the migrant and liberalization dummy interaction. So this coefficient is going to tell us if in the post-liberalization period, an increase in immigration is going to increase or reduce the import of intermediate goods coming from Eastern Europe. So we have a negative coefficient, meaning that actually in the post-liberalization period, if you have a higher number of immigrants from Eastern Europe, then you're going to import less of value added of in intermediate goods from these countries, which we interpret as a sign of substitution between immigration and offshoring. And then in the column 3, we use our instrumental variable, and the effect remains. And then in the column 4 to 6, we split. We use different measure of the share of migrants, meaning that we focus on migrants belonging to different skill groups. So what we see here is that actually most of the effect comes from migrants belonging to the low skill group, meaning that it's the increase of blue-collar workers that seems to have the arrival of blue-collar workers that seems to have an impact on offshoring.
May I just ask a quick
Yes.
question here? So
Sure.
how do you interpret the coefficient on the liberalization alone? So this means that it's what happens where the share of migrants is 0, is that correct?
Say again, I'm sorry.
So the coefficient on the second row, so the one on the liberalization, which is positive. So does that mean that imports increase in these countries for sectors where the share of migrants was very low?
No, it means, so that coefficient means that in the post-liberalization period, for all on average for Western European countries, there was an increase in the import of intermediate goods, whatever the share of immigrants actually. Okay. Then if we want, so I talked about the level of the coefficient of the interaction. Obviously, you also have a direct effect of the presence of migrants, which is here positive. So if we want to know the actual effect of migrants on offshoring in the post-liberalization period, we need to take the first coefficient and the third together. And if we do so, then we can compute that post-liberalization, an increase in the share of Eastern European workers by 1%, which is a quite significant increase, but which is the average increase across Europe, leads to a decrease in the imports of intermediate goods by 10%. So this is a substitution between immigration and offshoring that I mentioned before. Also, to be clear, I need to say that we are not arguing here that in the post-liberalization period, there was some reshoring per se, because actually we are controlling with a bunch of fixed effect for the evolution with time. So what we're saying here is mostly that the arrival of Eastern European migrants reduced the intensity of offshoring from Western Europe to Eastern Europe. So then we conduct a bunch of robustness check to test for possible issues. So we use alternative instruments. So what we do is that we change the base year for the sectoral distribution. Instead of using 1998, we're going to use 1991 using data from IPUMS. And we also change the migration destination distribution. So instead of using 2000, we test with 1980, 1970, etc. Basically, what we find is that the effect remains for most specification, but the reason why we keep these two dates, 2000 and 1998, is mostly that if we look at the F statistics from the first stage, we usually find that this is the strongest combination. One possible explanation might be that actually there is not such a strong continuity in the pattern of immigration from Eastern Europe to Western Europe on the long period because of the communism of communism during 50 years in that area that cut the existent migration flows, the old pattern of migration flows. Then we use also a more restrictive fixed effect structure. So we do not only control for importer-exporter fixed effect, but we complement with time. So we find the same effect. One thing that we do is that we use a placebo strategy. So we apply the liberalization timing variable to other country blocks. So meaning that instead of using workers coming from the 10 countries that enter in 2004 and the 3 countries that enter in 2007, we replace the second enlargement, trade with the second enlargement with another area, another block of the world. So we replace an MS10 with EU15 or East Asia, Latin America, etc. So we do not expect this liberalization timing to have an impact, this liberalization variable to have an impact on trade with other blocks of the world which were not actually included in that liberalization. And this is what we find. So there is no significant coefficient either for the second row or for the third row, except, as you can see, for Southeast Asia. So that coefficient here can be explained mostly by the UK. So the UK did not actually, the UK instantly liberalized its market to Eastern European workers, and so we do not have the time dimension for the UK in that aspect. And if we remove the UK from the sample, then that significant coefficient disappears, and it looks like the other zones, other blocks. We also use different samples. So first thing that we do is we removed Ireland and UK from the sample, simply because, as you know, there was a large increase of immigration from Eastern Europe to the UK in that period, a really strong flow. And we could expect that actually our effect is driven by these 2 countries. So this is not the case. If we remove this country, we still have a significant interaction. And we also cut our sample in 2 parts. So before the Great Crisis, the Great Recession, and afterwards. And again, the effect is quite similar. One of the other things that we do is we drop one country and one sector at a time to check if there's some unique country or sector which is driving the effect. And this does not seem to be the case. So here in each column, we move one country, but the effect is pretty similar in each case. And if we remove one sector at a time, it's still the same. So it's not only manufacturing, for instance, which is driving all the effect, because if we remove manufacturing here in column 4, we still have the same results. So we delve a bit more in the possible mechanism that could explain what we find. Sorry. So what we find is a statistically significant negative link between trade and migration. And so our main hypothesis is that there's a lack of native workers with adequate skills to recruit in the destination countries in 2004, or that the wages are too high and it prevents local firms to hire native labor. In both cases, we expect Eastern European workers to be complementary rather than substitutable with native workers. So I'm not going to have time to present the possible theoretical background, but if you think about a framework such as Ottaviano and over 2013, then this can be explained quite easily. So in that framework, firms are basically using a bunch of tasks to produce their goods, but some tasks are better produced by migrant workers or by offshore workers. And so you are going to have you can define which task is going to be produced by which type of workers. And in that framework, if you lower the migration cost, so by liberalizing the labor market, for instance, then you're going to have some substitution between immigration and offshoring. So we do three things to test this possibility. The first thing is we look at how the arrival of Eastern European migrants affect trades with other countries in the world. So we replace here the trade of Eastern European countries with trade with other areas of the world. So we're going to look here at how immigrants from Eastern European countries affect imports coming from Latin America or North America. What we find is that actually these migrants also seem to substitute with trade coming from the rest of the world. So this is coherent with our explanation because we don't think that there's not anything special with Eastern European workers. We just think that they arrive in Western Europe at the right time and are able to be used by Western European sectors to limit offshoring.
Just to let you know, you're almost out of time, so if you can conclude in a minute or two.
Okay, I finished then. The other thing that I want to show you very quickly is the effect on overtime hours. So we want to construct a measure of labor needs, and we think that the number of overtime hours done by native would be such a measure. So we think that if a company or sector is trying to hire some workers but has some difficulties to do so, is going to ask more of its current workforce. And so there's going to be a higher number of overtime hours done by native workers. So what we do is we check if in the post-liberalization period, the arrival of foreign migrants actually reduces overtime workers by native workers. And this seems to be the case in column 1 and 2. You can see that the interaction reduces the use of overtime by natives. Then the other columns, I'm not going to delve into them, but they look at the substitution between different type of immigrants and between immigrants and native workers. So just to conclude, what we do is that we use sectoral level data on workers from Eastern Europe and present in Western Europe. And we also use occupation information, which is something which is not often done in that literature. We use trade in value added. So we are able to exploit this data on global value chain and European value chains. And we use imported domestic value added as a measure of offshoring. And we exploit this difference in the timing of labor market liberalization of Western European countries to provide evidence of substitution between offshoring and low-skilled immigration. Back of the envelope calculation shows that actually the labor market liberalization reduced offshoring by $3 billion over the period. And finally, we do not seem to find adverse effect on native workers. And this inflow of Eastern European workers affect offshoring towards the entire world. So I thank you for listening to me, and I look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, Bastien, for this very interesting presentation. So from the audience, if you would like to ask a question, please feel free to raise your virtual hand, and I will give you the floor to ask your question. If maybe I can start while you think about that. So there was one just comments that I had. I mean, I think it's very interesting what you find. I was just conceptually trying to think about what's happening here. So your story is that actually before you would import the intermediary good, and now you hire the migrant workers directly at home and you produce it there. So I'm thinking that maybe this will be easier for type of goods that don't require a lot of capital. Because if you have to invest in machinery to produce these things at home, it might take more time. So I'm wondering whether you can maybe test some of the heterogeneity of the effect across, for instance, the capital needs to produce this kind of intermediary goods.
That's an interesting comment, and that's something that, not in that exact form, but it's a comment we already had, I think. And it's something that we want to do actually. It's a bit hard because in the wired data we do not have really disaggregated information regarding trade. So we have a certain number of sectors, but we're not really. It's a bit hard actually to differentiate between this capital incentive or capital intensive and the labor intensive sectors. But it's something that we want to do. That's for sure. So one thing that we thought about doing was actually not to focus on the intensity of capital, but on the complexity of the goods, rather using some measure that already exists. Yeah. But it's something that we have to look at actually, because it would help also to delve a bit more in the mechanism and to justify what we are finding.
Yeah, and especially, I mean, I was wondering whether you may want to present the trade to and like the imports to any other country maybe as your main result, because given that your story is really the substitution, there is no reason to believe that it will only decrease imports just from this country, but on aggregate.
No, definitely. I mean, and that's what we show. If we replace trade with of Eastern Europe with another country blocks of the world, we do see the same effect. The thing is that we have to match workers to. So we have in the end we have two different origins in the baseline regression. We have the 10 countries that enter in 2004 and the other that enter in 2007 and later. And we have to match the share of migrants from these two origins to trade. So it's not like we can just use the same aggregate imports for the entire world and match it with two different type of immigrants. So that's why we present the result in that way. But it's maybe we could put that more forward. Yeah.
Are there any questions from the audience?
In the meantime, maybe if that's okay, Sarah, I would have a question, rather general one. Do you, I'm not exactly familiar with the literature, so I wonder if there is anything about the effects on FDI. So would you consider FDI as rather, a complement or a substitute to trade? And how does this, play into migration, especially in this EU enlargement or in this EU liberalization case?
It's not something we look at, but there is some literature on FDI actually in that a bunch of the literature on the substitution between offshoring and immigration. So in particular, you have the paper by Hillel Rapoport. I don't recall the year, but it's one paper which actually looks at the substitution between FDI and immigration. And I think that what they find is that actually in that papers they find that there's a complementarity between FDI and immigration flows. What they do not do is that they do not look at the sectoral level, at aggregate country level. So in our case, indeed, we might expect that there was an increase in FDI in the post-liberalization period that would have a counteracting effect on what we find. Maybe we have to think a bit about what could be a measure of FDI to account for that.
It would be possible. I mean, I think it could be interesting, to actually look at the interplay between the three, because it's not only in a way trade and immigration, but you always have FDI sort of in the.
Yeah, but that's quite true, because also FDI. Yeah. So the way we thought about FDI, I think it was more of an alternative measure to or offshoring measure, but it could be something to be explored.
Good. Well, I have a few more questions, but maybe Alexia, you can conclude since we're out of time, and then we can continue the conversation afterwards.
Okay, I'm just going to have to kick you out from sharing your screen. Sorry for that. Oops, can you see my screen? I do not see the green thing around it. You know, it makes me always confident it's there. That's perfect. Okay, thank you very much. I'm actually looking forward to having a few more minutes of time afterwards to discuss also the questions that Sarah has. We will see you all on May 3rd, so next week, where we will welcome Barbara Sedova, who will speak about global food prices, local weather, and migration in sub-Saharan Africa. In the meantime, we ask you to visit our website in case you would like to find out more about the junior seminar or as well about the senior seminar, to look at videos of past presentations, to find out who's next in our schedule. And we also review submissions on a rolling basis. Please feel free to email us at junioreconomic@gmail.com. Furthermore, we have this new feature in 2021 where participants may register in advance as panelists to interact more closely with the organizers and also with the speaker. So even, you know, during the 40 minutes presentation, you can interact maybe a bit more deeply. We do ask our panelists to please read the paper in advance and register before Friday, the Friday before the Monday, and join 5 minutes prior to the start so we can make sure we have the time to promote you. Okay, in the meantime, thank you very much and have a lovely week, everyone.
Good.